This panel, the idea for it really intrigues me because the Internet of Things is, and the big data that it can generate and is connected to is, I think, one of the things that's going to really reshape the data landscape, the privacy landscape, the security landscape, and also the possibilities of benefits for all of us, for what cities can do, manufacturing, medicine, the general consumer. And the Internet of Things is basically, might be summed up as just chips with everything that can be connected to the net. And that usually, generally, is thought of in particular as things that can talk and share data with other things that are also dispersed across the Internet of Things. And I know that we always hear these different numbers for how many devices, how many items, sensors, devices, machines are connected to form the IoT, but right now, Gartner's current estimate is about 8 billion things, although I know Cisco was saying it was 8 billion things in 2012, I think, so it's quite a disputed figure. Gartner's predicting 20 billion by 2020. And that's a lot of things connected on the net in a market that's still very much nascent and is still developing standards and has very few standards so far, and where data and device security, transparency, and privacy pose their own major challenges, especially when one connected device may involve smart parts from several third-party suppliers. So there's a lot, so we'll talk, I hope, dive in a bit to trust. Trust also meaning the trust of your own partners, and not just maybe the consumer need for trust or business need for trust. And the widely respected security expert Bruce Schneier, about 2 years ago at the RSA Data Security Conference in San Francisco, actually called for us to really slow down this growing Internet of Things and perhaps start to disconnect this new internet until we can understand and secure it better. So all of these topics I'm hoping we'll be able to explore with this panel, which I wonderfully has 3 completely different backgrounds and in different areas, and I think can give us good insight into how diverse the Internet of Things is and what some of these issues are. So let me start by, I have to look at my lineup, who I have. To my immediate left here, I have Eddie Dillon, who's the Director of Innovation at KBC Bank Ireland, with responsibility for digital transformation and innovation across the bank's operations. And he also runs a new innovation hub in Dublin, developing solutions for personal banking customs in Ireland, and then to roll that out further across markets in Central Europe. Then I have Angelo Capossele, who's a researcher interested in applied cryptography, one of my favorite areas of writing. The Internet of Things, security, and privacy. And he's an IoT data technologist at Digital Catapult in London, where he works with a couple of different interesting initiatives he can tell us more about, including exploring the role of blockchain technology on improving trust and transparency of smart cities operations, marketplaces, and management of personal data. And then last here we have Paddy Flynn from Google, who joined Google in 2009 and is currently the director of the trust and security team for EMEA and APAC. And this involves managing a multi-market team who work across Google's core products, working to ensure user safety through adherence and promotion of Google's guidelines and policies. And he's also been leading Google's engagement with the Irish startup community, and I'm interested as well in how all of this IoT affects startups, and do startups have special considerations as well. But maybe we can start just by having each of you talk a bit about your own role and perspective on, what are your companies or what is your research doing in the area of IoT, and give our audience a flavor of what the IoT means in different sectors, in your sector. maybe start with Eddie.
Start with myself. So good afternoon, everybody. Maybe to start with a confession. Firstly, I'm a banker, and secondly, I'm an accountant, and that's usually enough for people to stage a walkout in its own right. But there's probably people here who are far more informed and more authoritative on Internet of Things. But from a banking point of view, the Internet of Things is, as a concept, as an output, it's data, and data is ultimately everything that is powering banks at this moment in time. From my own part, as you mentioned, I'm Director of Innovation, and what that translates to in an Irish context is KBC Bank is a challenger bank here. We are not a traditional bank. As a group, we're a bank and insurer in 6 different nations, but in Ireland, we are looking to pioneer a different way of banking. So that means that it's banking for the modern lifestyle. And that modern lifestyle is one that's 24 hours a day. So people will want relevant products and services at any time of the day and night, which means that we need to transition all of the services that we offer in a traditional way onto mobile devices, in a very clean and simple way. Data is the only way that we can do that. So we recognize the connectivity of devices. We recognize that people will engage with us through different channels, telephony, mobile devices, etc. And it's the way in which we can aggregate all of that information because, firstly, we need to equip ourselves in the service that's offered initially. Secondly, we need to ensure that we can do so at a time that the products that we position on a proactive basis are relevant to them at that particular juncture. And thirdly, that we both manage and administer any of that data in a compliant way, not least the GDPR discussion that is inevitable as part of this discussion. So maybe just to conclude from a commercial agenda point of view, what we will be delivering, and as recently as this morning with a new app that we launched, but all products and services will be available instantly 24 hours a day. That includes credit decisioning, it means asset management, it means insurance needs. So every traditional service that you expect in a bank, but offered in a completely different and unique way.
Wow, okay. Angelo?
So I work for Digital Catapult, as Karlin said. And okay, I'm just going to give you a small introduction about what we are doing there. So we are helping, Digital Catapult is a non-for-profit company, and we are helping the UK businesses of all sizes to grow digitally. And by doing so, we hope that we can stimulate also debates and discussion about a very important topic, at least for me, such as security and privacy and trust around IoT, the IoT world. And personally, I'm a strong background on cryptography, and I've always been interested in the IoT because it's the conjunction of the physical world with the cyberspace. And this process has a strong implication in the way that we are living. And we see this also in several European initiatives in which we are involved. One of these is the European Platform Initiative around IoT, and also the European Large-Scale Pilot, which are big European projects in which a lot of partners are gathered together to think about aspects such as interoperability, standardization, of course, security around IoT, to try to understand how to address these topics in a European level. And more specifically, I'm involved in one of these projects around these initiatives, which is called Synchronicity, which is a project that it brings together 8 cities from Europe, and also a number like 30 partners together to address, let's say, to enable and to build a common framework on how cities can build more efficient solution for their cities. So we are trying to understand how we can exploit IoT solutions to make maybe the transport system more efficient, the the life of citizens better, so they can exploit services in an easier way. We can try to understand how we can exploit IoT also to open a channel of communication directly to between the citizen and the cities. And it's not the only, let's say, sector where I think IoT has a good opportunity to improve our life. Also, in the creative industries, I see a lot of space for exploitation, and also in the digital manufacturing, where we can think about a change and a more efficient way to produce every object that we can see around us. And maybe I'm talking too much.
No, that's fine. I think that gives a really good overview. And we'll come back and dive into some of those specifics in a moment. And Paddy?
So from, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I think it is. Okay, good. Oh, there we go. So my I suppose, two jobs, and as Karlin said, I work with startups quite a bit. So I'll talk a little bit how I touch off IoT in that role. We have a program called Google for Entrepreneurs. Some of you may or may not be aware of that, but it's really trying to get into the community. And we have a big footprint here in Dublin. Google has thousands of employees and people involved. So I've been trying to get those very much involved in different community programs, and one of those is startups. So we have a relationship with Dogpatch Labs, and we'll engage at various different levels. Many of the startups that we come across these days have an IoT basis to them. Some of them extremely helpful. You know, some of them can be about a Fitbit that you might wear that's about you, or about your home. I am an IoT enthusiast at home, which drives my family nuts, because I think we can come back to that. Much of it isn't that well connected, and the interoperability is still very poor, and so on and so forth. You go into your community, you go into your country, and you look at the planet, and you look at all of those kind of things and where IoT can be beneficial in the years to come. Through that initiative, also working with Dublin City Council on a Smart Cities initiative. I've been doing that for the last couple of years, trying to bring academia, industry, Dublin City Council together and see, could we create some test beds in Dublin around IoT, and at an infrastructure level as well as at a use case level. And there's many of those going on. Intel have some really interesting stuff happening in Croke Park. Microsoft, Cisco are very involved at the infrastructure level, and lots of others as well. So trying to bring order to that herding cats with Jamie Cudden from DCC. We've been doing some interesting stuff, and we've got some interesting programs going on there. So that's one side. The other side is what was actually up to very recently, trust and safety, which I've done for 8.5 years at Google. I've just actually moved into the geo end of things, which is actually very interesting from an IoT perspective as well. But in that sense, we would have dealt a lot with policy development, product policy development and enforcement, and would have come across many of these issues around trust, transparency, privacy, security, and touch off all of those. And it is a tricky area. I could ask for a poll there. How many people in the room have ever done a privacy checkup on Google, if you are a Google user? A few. Security checkup. Actively changed your My Account settings. Okay, and this is a very educated audience, so it's less than 50%, and it's a real challenge. We've put a huge amount of effort into these things, and we've done a lot of research. How many people use incognito mode in search most of the time? 1. 2, 3. I use it sometimes myself as well. But we've done some interesting research around that as an example, where people, do they think their internet history is being recorded if they are using incognito mode? And it depends on whether they're obviously signed in or not. But your internet history is also recorded in your My Account if you are signed in a normal session. And we did some interesting research on that, and the vast majority of people we're not aware of that, despite us. So the user awareness, despite what regulations might come, most people know about the again, it's just a privacy thing. The consent law in the EU for cookies. You know, when you go into a website and you say for the first time, you say yes. So we had a lot of users in Germany, in particular, who were incognito mode users, and they constantly wrote to us and said, "Why do you keep in Chrome giving me this consent message?" And it is funny, but we got an awful lot of messages around that. And obviously, well, you're in incognito, so we don't know who you are from previously. So we have to give you this message every single time. And there's a view of regulations and users and technology being completely way behind each other. And I think things like GDPR is going to be a real challenge for users to consume and understand. So we've done a lot of analysis. Researchers on my team have looked at some of this stuff in the past, and it's very, very interesting in terms of where real users are versus where we think they should be, and it's a real challenge to join those dots. So
that's a really interesting entree then into the first question I want to ask about trust, because obviously this trust is critical to people, businesses, 100%. Partners wanting to use some of what you're producing and offering, or trusting Absolutely. When they go into a city. And yet, you know, as we just saw from that brief questioning process, most people don't really use some of the tools that are there for them, which suggests an interesting balance between what needs to be provided, what is asked to be provided, what should be provided regardless of whether people ask for it, because actually they need it even if they don't know they should be asking for it. In that kind of context, then, what does trust mean for the Internet of Things? And maybe start with, I mean, in fintech, anything to do with finance and the consumer and the business, obviously this is critical. How do you define trust, and how do you create it? Yeah, well, that's for someone in banking, and for someone in banking in Ireland, trust is possibly the most relevant topic for the last 10 years. So it is something that has not only occupied us, but it has been all-consuming. I've said that about data earlier. But anyway, when it comes to trust, we are nigh on 10 years since our crisis in Ireland. What happened after that was consumers lost all and complete trust in their financial services providers, most notably the banks in Ireland. And although we are a Belgian bank, we are not immune to the impact of that. So we are paranoid about trust. We recognise that no sustainable business model can be built without it, and it needs to be rigorously monitored and managed. So first of all, from a reputational point of view, consumers need to have full and complete transparency about everything that you are providing to them. That is, in a finance context, anything from the terms attaching to products and services to the way in which you'll use the data that they provide and you manage on their behalf. But your point about people aren't availing of the privacy rights that are afforded to them currently. It is up to us to educate. So we must be very, very clear. There are regulatory provisions coming in this regard, but on a proactive basis, you must be building up that level of trust through transparency from the outset, and an education so that people know what rights are afforded to them, and what privacy rights that they also attach. Okay, and maybe Angelo, that issue of privacy and trust, maybe take it from that angle.
Yeah, sure. So talking about privacy and trust regarding IoT, it's a very tricky question, because I mean, IoT is touching so many aspects of our life that you should try to focus maybe on a specific sector when you try to define trust and privacy, and also it depends on the demography and cultural difference for people. I mean, what is privacy for me could be a different definition of privacy for somebody else. But in general, I can say that within the IoT world, privacy is again, a right of deciding whether to share some information that could be, in the case of devices, measurement coming from our body or our environment in the city that could track us. And also, if you have the right to share this information when you want and according to your own term, then it's a way to increase, let's say, the trust that you have on using these devices. But there is also another level of trust, which is actually more related not to data but to the actual functioning of the device. Because in the IoT space, we have plenty of solutions that are very cheap because they have to perform just simple operation. But since they have, again, still computational capabilities, and also they could be connected to internet, they can be act very easily. So also, a lot of manufacturers are trying to build smart things, and they are smart because they can collect data, they can process information, they can react based on the context. But they are also trying to be competitive. So they, for instance, if you are trying to decide whether buy a router for your home, and maybe it's gonna be cheap, so you just need a router to connect to internet. And so the manufacturer has to cut the cost of producing the device. So maybe this device is not going to be able to store more information, in the sense that maybe an update of the firmware could not be possible. So it's a big problem, because we are surrounding us by having a lot of devices that are connected to internet, but we are not sure if they are trusted now or if they are going to be trusted tomorrow.
Yeah, and this is what I know that specifically what Bruce Schneier was noting was these inexpensive chips that are being thrown into so many of these devices and may really have no security inbuilt into them, and where we lack standards or requirements right now, we don't know, there's no way of verifying this. And Paddy, maybe could you continue on with that, maybe taking a bit of a security angle there as well?
I think Angelo touched on it very well. So I think there's a few different things. On the utility, I think intuitively users understand the having to trade some of themselves online for utility. So if you want to use, say, a Nest device or a smart device that you're logged into to share information with you or turn your heating on from a distance, you have to be logged in and you're sharing some of yourself. So security plays a critical role in saying you want that to be a secure conversation and not accessible. I think some of the big challenges, which Angelo touched on, are as the 20 billion pieces come online, the level to which they are secure. And I think human nature generally is very reactive. So there'll be a critical threshold or a critical issue that will then generally create a reaction. How many people have been hacked here before in their accounts in any shape or form? Okay, and did you have two-factor authentication turned on before you were hacked or not? No. Do you now? Yeah. No. Yes. I hope so. In general, again, our experience, having run much of this, there's a lot of tools out there where you can make yourself more secure, but human nature is not to do that until you have an incident. And I think this is a real challenge in terms of education. Coming back to the devices themselves, users then need to be informed or be able to understand, is this something that I can trust? And getting into firmware understanding or level of updating, I think that's a real challenge. We can't expect users to understand that. So I think we will hit a critical point where there'll be a major fail, and this will bring all of this into sharp focus in the years to come when we hit large numbers of devices that people are relying upon.
And are we moving too quickly then, maybe, is the question, and how do we address this in the, what do we need in terms of regulation, oversight bodies? Maybe the whole panel might want to take some different aspects of that question.
Well, I'll continue and then maybe hand back to Andrew. I'm sure he's got a strong view on it. I don't know that you can ever say you're moving too quickly because there's a lot of innovation. And regulations lag. That's just by the nature. And expecting bodies to set regulations. I think the more... the generation, and unfortunately I can say the generation or two behind me, will be probably better informed for some of those things, or be much clearer and maybe better educated. But I do think early education is a critical place to start, so people are informed and understand how to trade privacy for utility and understand security. But I do think security, it's a critical one, and like Angelo said, that it's expediency. We trade cybersecurity for expediency now. So are the devices updatable? How often are they checked? Will they be around in 20 years' time? And the vast majority of what's been defined now will not be, but could actually still function and be interrogated. So it's they're probably more societal debates and debates for forums like this, but I don't think there's any clear answers to those just yet. But it is by raising them and then you engage. But I don't know that you can say stop things from moving or stop innovation. You want to keep that going, but try and bring the debate with it so that there isn't as big a time lag.
Right. Okay, Angela?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Paddy said. And I can also maybe add that from a technological point of view, and more specifically from a cryptographic point of view, if you go and talk with the cryptographer, they are going to tell you that a lot of actually the problems that we have, they have already been solved by solutions. On the other hand, these solutions can be more or less efficient and easy to be adapted by the producers that are making these things. And here I see a big role of the government that should try to speed up and follow the pace of technology, which is very fast, and typically policymakers have to be more slow to adapt and find the policy to make the producers and in general to fix the market problem of selling products that are not safe, that they are not protecting your data, your sharing. What we can do is also to try to work all together, actually, not only from a technical point of view, not only from a government point of view, but also at ethical level. Maybe some philosopher can step in and try to change and adapt the definition of trust and privacy that we have to actually change now, because the world where we are living is changing so fast, and typically our mind, it doesn't work as fast as technology. I mean, we try to have this moral notion of privacy and trust that are sticked in our mind from generations. So it's a more slow process.
Okay, and maybe banking obviously is critical for
I mean,
security.
I suppose I'm at risk of being fairly one-dimensional. I think that it's probably not unreasonable to assume that at the pace of adoption at a macro level will go at one pace, and then financial services as a whole will lag.
Yeah.
There is a not unreasonable regulatory paranoia as financial institutions and in the wider data processing and administration world that will mean that we will lag the real pace of adoption.
Does the existing regulatory environment in finance have the ability to encompass the Internet of Things challenges?
That is a question probably better answered by a regulator, but maybe one perspective that I would have is that we need to embrace at a very minimum the digitization of financial services in isolation, and then into the wider opportunities that we can embrace in the Internet of Things. So I think we need to crawl before we can walk.
Okay. But an obvious continuation of this as well is Europe more likely to begin to regulate over, say, the United States or North America, just because of the implications of the privacy and data collection, data protection elements of the Internet of Things, and maybe we might touch on the GDPR, the incoming General Data Protection Regulation, which has some quite sobering levels of potential fines and quite strict requirements on what might happen if there are data breaches.
Can I
do you want to take that?
So I'm very excited about the GDPR because I think it's a really good tool for everybody, for sure for citizen and consumer first, because it's a really, actually, I think in Europe, Europe is very good at trying to address more quickly than other places these issues. And GDPR is one of these examples. There are also other initiatives that I'm aware of that they are not ready, but Europe is working on, such as standardization on compliance for vulnerability disclosure, and also initiative to try to, let's say, label the level of trust and security of products, and also patch management. So I'm very happy about what is happening in Europe. And talking about the GDPR, a lot of rights are going to be, let's say, highlighted by this regulation. So user finally will have more tools to take the control on their own data. So they will be able to let's say, have more power and decide whether when you sign into a new application or a service or program, or we are going to use, I don't know, the new smartwatch, whether you want to share your data with the third party, or you want maybe to understand where your data are being stored, how they are being protected, and also what kind of data are being collected and for how long. And then you can even have other rights to decide to erase your data from this particular service, and or maybe to port this data to another server application. And on the other side, from the business perspective, it depends on how they, I think, this is my opinion, how they are gonna tackle this regulation, because it could be an opportunity to increase transparency and trust and increase the baseline of your user if you're a business. But if you are gonna overlook this regulation, it could be a lot of pain.
Yeah, and this is an obvious question to put to Google, who might have a slightly Google perspective might be slightly different from your perspective on this. But I also just wanted to note as well. Again, that answer sort of comes back to the complexity of IoT devices, where we were just talking about the security and these multiple suppliers of these various elements that might go into a single thing, and who's getting the data can be transferred so many different ways in different places, and do we know where it's going? So all of this kind of regulatory thing with the GDPR, I think, is going to be quite important. But Paddy,
I wouldn't say Google. What Angelo described would have been probably a pretty much clear position we've had for a long time around transparency, and the building of the tools that I described earlier on has elements of that have been going on for years. The transparency report that we've been putting out for years as well, on the other side. So I think the issue will be for a lot of small businesses, building that kind of capability is going to be really difficult. I think it's more straightforward for a Google to be on top of that, even though it's a big program for us nonetheless. But transparency is core. I think the difference between being transparent and users' understanding, and I think GDPR is arguably designed for power users, not for Joe Blogs yet. And that's a gap. And how we close that gap, I think, is going to be an issue. From all the research and analysis, we've tried a number of things, and we've done a lot of stuff. My teams have done a lot of outreach on security to individuals, to companies, and it is extremely hard to get the message across.
Yeah.
So I think that to me is one big challenge with GDPR. I think it's the principles of it are great, but and companies will be forced to, whether they like it or not, to build the tools and try and educate. I think portability, takeout, all that kind of stuff is great as well. But the challenge will be users really understanding it and getting up to speed with it.
Okay, and I'd love to throw the floor open for questions as well. If there's maybe just as people out there are thinking of something that they might like to ask the panel, just to come back to Paddy, just in terms of the startup.
Yes.
What are there special considerations for startups?
So I think this is what Angelo referenced earlier on. Many startups will, to get up and running, to get scale, will I suppose, sacrifice security for expediency, for cheapness of manufacture, and will not think about it. Because to think about security, so not so much privacy and security, because they're not the same thing, or even transparency, the ability to, if you find a vulnerability in firmware, the ability to be able to communicate with that device and update the firmware, having enough memory or enough capability in the product, in the physical product, to accept those kind of updates. Designing for the fact that they will go end of life at some point, and so on. So you can see massive utility and application in the startup space. But the challenge is, and I think going into the future will be, there'll be a higher cost depending on how the story goes to make IoT devices work. Again, depends on the application. Low power devices serving on narrowband IoT networks for smart cities may well be okay, as long as they're not hackable and messed around with, from turning city lights on and off. You know, somebody being able to hack and do that straightforwardly. So these are things that I think councils who put those kind of contracts out there will need to make sure that the devices are secure. As part of the thing we're working with Dublin City Council on is to test these things early. See what they're like, understand do they work. Do not sign up to a 20-year program that gets you locked in with something that may not be around in 20 years. And these are conversations that we're actually having. So I think it's a difficult one for startups in times to come. It's wide open right now, and I think security is traded for expediency of delivery and scale.
Okay, questions? I don't know, do we have a microphone, or anyone out there with we have a question way back here? Is there anyone doing a microphone, or should I can run up with I can do it. No, here. You're the panel, you have to answer the question.
Keep that, right?
Let's see.
Hi, my name is Andrea. Thank you all for your very interesting thoughts. I have so many questions. So many questions. But I'm just going to stick to one that is maybe more general and touches on all of your work and experience in the field. I'm curious, what is the difference between needs and wants in the IoT innovation world?
Sorry, needs and?
Wants.
Ah, okay.
A need and a want.
Yeah. Well, you know, IoT is not that different with respect to other technologies. Sometimes there are needs that has to be addressed, and technology is here to give those needs. But I think that in IoT, at least in the consumer market, a lot of solutions are just there because they think that they are great, but they are not. And they are just a way to maybe, I'm not sure, try to enter in your home and gather more data. It could be. But I think that when you then see the world of businesses and cities, I think what is going on there is more a real need to improve our life, because you can actually be more efficient on developing and deploying your solution. You can save a lot of money. You can open up a lot of good opportunities that can be exploited. So it's a trade-off. I mean, everywhere you can find people that try to just to exploit and to let's say surf the trend, and other people that are actually leveraging the technology to make useful stuff. That's my point.
I'd agree. I think even at a consumer level, I think health will play. Certainly the devices in the health space and monitoring will play a big role. And I think that's beginning. So prevention, I think, and I think that's very much a need versus a want. So being able to lower the cost of monitoring diabetes, lower the cost of and putting that in the control of consumers or users themselves. So I think that's a need and a real opportunity. Equally at a kind of a city traffic management efficiency that level, I think that's a real need for the future for the environment and for cities. I think where it becomes a want, it's playing at home with. I guess with your music, assisted living, maybe, you know, people would say, well, I'm going to become very dependent on that. Most of us, you know, or a lot of people, certainly in the US, will shop online now with Amazon and get stuff delivered. Most of us in Europe probably still like to go out and do our own bit of shopping and treat it as whatever. But, you know, so I think as societies changes and consumers want assisted living to save them time so they can do more things, that probably falls into the wants space, arguably, depending on who you are.
Okay.
Hi, Shane McNamees here.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Eddie, I think she'd also like...
Oh, yeah, certainly. Although that was far more authoritative than I could ever proclaim to be. But the needs and wants distinction, from a financial point of view, there is no needs. The wants are there. Ultimately, once there's a basic level of wealth and health, they're the needs. The wants are clearly the unfulfilled opportunities that exist. So the connectivity of all of these devices and the opportunities are limitless. But from a needs point of view, ultimately, how can we improve a basic health and a basic level of sustainable wealth thereafter? It's purely discretionary.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, as Shane McNamees here, and my question is very much building on Andrea's question, going from rather than seeing it from the needs of the consumer, whether the consumer needs or wants something, or the purpose of the device or the service. My question is about the needs of the producer or service provider. What do they actually need? What data do they need? What level of Internet of Things, what level of online connectivity is strictly speaking necessary for them to perform that function? And how much of it is maybe perhaps, and it's been, you know, companies have been accused of this in the past, of a little bit of a land grab. Essentially, it's, look, if you can get someone to agree to have this to have this device be online enabled and constantly streaming data, whether or not it's strictly speaking necessary, well, sure, why not do that? You know, it could be worth money or it could be useful in the future. And there's a lot of backlash. People who are skeptical about whether absolutely every single thing needs to be connected to the Internet of Things, whether things need to be always online as well, even if they are connected. Could it be at certain points in the day? Does it need to be constantly connected? And whether certain things functions just as well, certainly from the consumer point of view, as a closed-looped or near closed-loop system. So my question was just, do people see that as an issue? Do they think there's a way of addressing that, maybe right at the start, particularly with startups that they don't go for this unless they need to? And does the GDPR impact this? Do the implications of only processing data for the purpose you actually need it for, do you reckon that's going to have an impact on these sorts of products and services? Thanks.
There's a load in that, Shane. There's like 10 questions.
I was going to say that's the next panel for next year.
I'll try and pick a few of those themes that you hit on. I think we already hit some of that. So with a mobile phone, which arguably is an IoT device in its own right, and if you look at any applications that you download, the permissions that you give, I think we've got a lot better over the last number of years in making that transparent to users. But the number of people, again, I go back to, who look at what apps are asking from a permissions perspective is low. I know internally in Google, it's a conversation that we've had quite a bit for third-party apps that we host in the Play Store, for example, and maybe testing and warning users. They've asked for this permission. Do you understand that? And I think part of that comes back to the transparency piece. I think at an IoT device level, there's trade-offs in there for manufacturers. The extent to which data is being over-collected, it's a bit of an open question. I think when you go into voice control devices and signed-in accounts and the level of integration that you want to have, you're sharing more and more data. I think it does play into the GDPR kind of side of things, because any of that data that you give, there's rights for the consumer to take that and erase it, like Angelo was saying, and port it to somewhere else. I think the challenge for startups in that is building that level of functionality in from the beginning is going to be extremely difficult. However, what you might see, particularly in today's world, is cloud services developing, which enables them to do that. That also then may bring a level of standards with it around at least the software security layer, and hopefully over time. But as I said earlier on, I think a major breach at a technical level is what's going to drive improvement in technical components. And today it's laissez-faire, anything goes. Again, I see a lot of these debates happen internally, talking about that at a device level and trying to influence that at an industry level, but it's just not there yet, and certainly not for startups yet, at the technical device level.
Okay. Somebody else like to take that one as well, or?
Maybe I can just add to think to this topic. So if you look at how IoT started, actually, I think that maybe the first starting point is to consider the cyber-physical system in industry. And then in the academia, there was this huge movement about wireless sensor network, that were basically objects and devices that were connected to each other, building networks among private networks, let's say. They were not directly connected to internet unless you were using a gateway to then access the devices from the external network. But I think that when businesses and companies started to think, how can we monetize out of this IoT? Are we just going to sell devices? They have to be cheap, so maybe we can also exploit other channels to monetize. And I think that the race to connect every devices to internet it could be let's say an excuse to gather more data, and then maybe they are not even sure what to do with this data. They are just collecting, and maybe they are gonna even spend more money to run machine learning algorithm to produce insight about this data. Unless you are a big company, of course, you have already the infrastructure. But for small, medium enterprises, I don't think it's a smart move to over-collect. Also because of the GDPR, you have to try to minimize the amount of data that you are collecting. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess to manage all this data. And I think somehow, as Paddy said, it has to be thought very well from the beginning, especially if you're a startup. That's my point of view.
Any other questions? Okay, come back here. I might just quickly, while I'm heading up here, I just wanted to say, maybe somebody would address this issue of the big hacking picture, where if we're talking about something like smart cities and integrating grids and traffic controls, and we already had this case in, where was it, Texas, where all the system was hacked and all the warning sirens went off. Didn't that happen a couple of weeks ago? I think a lot of people now are looking at those big, scary movie scenario, everything fails, and the Internet of Things enables it. So maybe, could someone do with that? And I'll bring this mic back up here.
I think there's been plenty of examples of that, both, and again, without going into the underground, I mean, the kind of Stuxnet stuff and the stuff with Siemens and the Iran hacking way back when, and the NSA and Edward Snowden. We used to think that stuff was made up, but apparently it's true. And I can't verify any of that, obviously. But
come on.
You can speak to you can think of obviously in the US the meddling in elections and the kind of deliberate fake creation of information versus maybe influencing, which has been around for a long time. So I think society is seeing a lot of these things now. I think the major hacks and so on, and what we see, I think back to maybe a smart cities or smart infrastructure or everything being connected to the grid, nuclear power stations, those kind of things. I think there's a strong awareness at that level of infrastructure already. Whether they're well protected is a very good question. But I do think the things that happened many years ago with the backdoors into some of those major systems have certainly made those major manufacturers who deploy at that infrastructure level very aware. And you also see the big debates within governments as well, because governments are very much part of this, of backdoors into private devices and our information. So it's a really other difficult challenge on the other side of that. The encryption debates on WhatsApp or those kind of things, end-to-end encryption, so I think it's a very tricky one. That bringing it all the way back to cities and IoT, smart cities, and so on. Back to what I said earlier, I think major deployments have to be tried and tested multiple times with all the dimensions of utility, security, privacy, all taken into account from a 360 perspective, and tested multiple times, and decisions not made on the basis of just pure cost, because that will lead to failures for sure.
Okay. Question?
Hello again. Mm-hmm. Now, back to GDPR. Much of the individual rights that are granted under GDPR have been existing before, and many of the principles like informed consent. Of course, there's some novelty, right to data portability and so on. But what makes this special is the incentive to actually comply in the forms of fines. But a entity has to be really not cooperating in order to get to those high levels of fines. So my question is, and another thing is that implementing GDPR is a pretty vague topic. The official suggestion for implementation comes out in December 2017, and that is 5 months before the law actually goes in. So my question is, how do we ensure that privacy doesn't become sort of a greenwashing object? And especially because you mentioned blockchain before, which is a non-regulated field at the moment. Ethereum is kind of pushing out a lot of decentralized apps, which is great, but do we just base it on trust?
Okay, can I add some comment on this? So I think that GDPR is an evolution of what there was already been before. I think that one of the way that you can actually try to make this time GDPR or this new regulation work is to also try to fix the problem of letting the users understand their rights and use them. So maybe when you are thinking to develop an idea, an IoT-based idea, and you are considering security in the big picture, you should also consider as well user experience and try to convey your message and your tool in an easy way so that the user is going to actually use them and exploit them. And regarding blockchain, I think it's a great technology. I think it's among the cryptographic techniques, blockchain is actually the one that is focusing on increase the trust, or at least spread the trust among a lot of nodes in the blockchain. And there are so many different kind of blockchain out there. There are the permissionless, as you mentioned, like Ethereum, and Bitcoin, where everybody can change the status of the system and can verify that actually the state is verified, is correct. And there are also other more common in the industry solutions that are called permissioned, where there are only a subset of nodes that can actually write and change and update the status of the overall system, and all other maybe node and user can verify that everything is working. So we are, let's say, experiencing a huge hype on blockchain. I don't think that every solution has to be fixed by using blockchain, but I'm sure that if used correctly, it could be a big tool to increase trust and transparency, because the immutability properties that it can provide and the non-repudiation. So it's bringing, let's say, public key cryptography more widespread in different sectors. And also, one last comment, also the thing that everything is becoming decentralized, so everyone should contribute. I see this mechanism of blockchain also as a good metaphor, as we can, how can we, let's say, improve the security issues and privacy issue. We should, all of us, feel part of the solution. We should work together and be responsible. Also on a user perspective, on how we are using the products and the system and the tools that are out there. So not only the government or the industry. I mean, it's also our fault if the things that are here are not working correctly.
Eddie, did you want to just add? I don't know, you haven't had a chance to say anything. We just need to wind up here. So you
sure, no, I mean, I just wanted to build on one point there, that particularly on GDPR. I think one thing that's not moving is the date in May and the fines. So whilst I don't welcome that, given the complexity of implementation, we do welcome the principles of it, and particularly your point about customer experience. That should be at the key principle here. And I was actually just reflecting there. I've got a watch, a tablet, and a phone all on me now, each of which I can go and make a payment with. What I don't want to do personally is, having made that payment, to be getting notifications from every other vendor around here that I'm in the locality. I want to be able to control that. I want to enjoy the customer experience of making the payment, but I don't want that data to be exploited elsewhere unless I so choose. So it should be the customer experience that is the heart and the key principle of implementing GDPR.
Okay, and I think we'll probably wrap up there unless you have something urgently.
I was going to say two very brief things. I think the GDPR is not a box-ticking exercise. I think that was maybe partly a question. Will it have teeth? I think people are taking it very seriously in general, or at least like Eddie said. So just to confirm that. I think some of it's not 100% clear how it's going to play, but 80% of it is, so, and there's a huge amount of effort going into it. Number one, I think on blockchain, I'm not a blockchain expert, but just to echo what Angelo said, I think it can help with one part of the IoT ecosystem, which is around authentication, but it is not a cure-all by any means. It's just a support or an enabler on the security side.
Fantastic. I think there's plenty there that you might want to grab these speakers with during the break or later on this evening for people who are going to hang around. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for giving us such an interesting discussion on a complex issue for the past hour. Thank you, Eddie, Angelo, and Paddy.